All right, today's lesson is 4.5. This is your bell work, so I want you to write a short sentence providing evidence as to why the following triangles are not congruent. So when you're done, come on back for the lesson. All right, for your table of contents, go ahead and write that down, and then come on back when you're finished. All right, so today we're going to take a little spin on proving triangles congruent. We're going to take it one step further. So we can see in the diagram that the triangles are congruent by angle, side, angle. And we want to talk today about what else we can conclude when we know that the triangles are congruent. Once we prove the triangles are congruent, what else can we say? Well, if I know that these triangles are congruent, which I just proved by saying angle, side, angle, that means also that all of the other parts that aren't labeled are also congruent. For example, angle B has to be congruent to angle E, and line segment AB has to be congruent to line segment DE, and then the final line segment BC has to be congruent to EF. So even though those things weren't labeled, once I proved the triangles were congruent by angle, side, angle, then I can say the rest of the parts are also congruent, the corresponding parts anyway. All right, so in your notes you need to write down the definition or the meaning of Cpctc, and then come on back when you're done. Okay, we need to be careful now because the only time the corresponding parts are congruent is if and only if you prove the triangles are congruent first. So first you have to prove the triangles are congruent, then you can say the corresponding parts are congruent. So here you have an if-then statement. So if the triangles are congruent, then their parts are also congruent. So go ahead and write that in your notes. All right, so I want to take a second and talk about how that's going to affect our proofs that we've been doing for the last few days. I want you to first notice that in my prove statement, it's not asking me to prove the triangles are congruent anymore. It's asking me to prove specific angles are congruent. Well, I can't prove the angles are congruent unless I first prove the triangles are congruent. So we're going to go through, and every single step is going to be the same as what we've been doing. For example, my last step right here down at the bottom right is I have proven these triangles are congruent by angle, side, angle. Because the triangles have been proven congruent, I can now say that the angles, angle M and angle O, are congruent to each other because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So it's just one little added step. Everything's the same that we've been doing, except now we're adding this one last thing where corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. All right, go ahead and take a moment in your notes and write down your strategy for your proofs. So again, it's pretty much the same. The first thing you're going to list is the given. Then in the body of the proof, you're going to identify the three congruent parts and provide evidence as to why they're congruent. Then you're going to write the triangle congruent statement, which we've done. So we've done 1 through 3 already. The only thing new is the fourth piece, where you are naming the part you are trying to prove congruent and then state the reason as Cpctc. So let's take a look at what that looks like. All right, so I have angle Q and angle R are congruent. Angle Q and angle R are congruent. And then I also have angle QPS is congruent to RSP. So QPS, oops, I'm missing a P here. QPS is congruent to RST. Okay, that's given. Okay, there's my 2 things. I have 2. I need 3 total. I'm missing one more thing, and if you are looking at the diagram like I am, you can see that there's a reflexive property going on here with this shared side right here. So I have a reflexive property there where PS is congruent to PS. And it looks like I now have three parts that I need to prove the triangle's congruent. I have an angle and an angle and a side, and an angle and an angle and a side. So the triangles are congruent by angle, angle, side. That's not what the question was asking me, though. I'm supposed to prove that SQ and PR are congruent. All right, well, now that I know that the triangles are congruent because of angle, angle, side, I can then say that SQ and PR are congruent to each other because of Cpctc. So since the triangles are congruent, I can now say that SQ and PR are also congruent because of corresponding parts. All right, given DE bisects FDG, so DE is this guy right here, and it is bisecting FDG, angle FDG. Well, if you recall from the last couple units ago, I guess it is now, that an angle bisector creates two equal angles or two congruent angles, so I know that those two angles are congruent. Then it also says FD and GD are congruent, so let's go ahead and label that and see where the proof takes us. All right, so they have split up the angles like we did, and that was because of a definition of an angle bisector. So angle FDE, which is what we already labeled, FDE and GDE are congruent because of definition of angle bisector. Then we have FD and GE are congruent. That was given. So notice how they split that up. Right here, after their first piece of given information, right here after this first piece of given information, they kind of stopped with the given information and then said, okay, I'm going to put that in there right now so I don't forget it. So the DE bisects FDG, then the very next statement says, okay, then those two angles have to be congruent because of definition of angle bisector. Then they're going back now and adding the second piece of given information, which is this, and that's where we are now. So I can see from my drawing that I have a pair of congruent angles and a pair of congruent sides. So I've got two things congruent. Now I need that third piece. And of course, I see a reflexive property, which seems to be popping up all over the place. So that will be my third piece. So I have DE is congruent to itself. And I can see now that my triangles are congruent by side, angle, side. And then I have side, angle, side over here. So they're congruent. And then finally, now I can say that F and G, angle F and angle G are congruent to each other because of Cpctc. All right, so that's it for today's lesson. I will leave you to do the proofs on your own. There's a practice worksheet on the website as well as a homework. So we'll see you next time. Have a good day.